Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. His boss forced him to attend a mandatory company party. He got injured there. Then, while he was recovering, she fired him. Boss Karen caused my injury, then fired me. My name's Marco, and I'm one of those people companies usually notice not by my voice, but by the fact that somehow everything just works. I never liked meetings, never liked corporate games, never liked talking just to fill silence. I liked it when the system processed orders without delays, when the logs were clean, when support wasn't flooded in the morning with tickets marked urgent. For several years, I worked at a private logistics company in a large city in the southern United States. I won't name the city, not because I'm afraid, but because I don't want unnecessary conversations. Anyone who's worked in logistics will recognize the type of company anyway. A big office, several warehouses across the region, ambitions like, we're almost Amazon, just closer to the customer, and constant chaos hidden behind polished presentations. I joined as a back-end developer and eventually became the person holding together the core of their order distribution system. Basically, when a customer clicked buy, our system had to decide within seconds on several things: which warehouse had the item in stock, which warehouse was closest to the buyer, where the load was lighter, which carrier was available, what the SLA requirements were for that specific client, whether inventory was running low, whether synchronization between two regional nodes had stalled. It sounds simple until you add thousands of SKUs, promotions, returns, B2B reserves, delayed inventory updates, and managers demanding, make it like our competitors, but by Friday. I didn't build that system entirely from scratch myself. That would be a lie. But I was the one who assembled it from scraps, rewrote critical parts, patched it, optimized it, and moved it from it still sort of holds to it actually works. Most importantly, I knew all its strange corners, why one client with an overnight delivery contract sometimes went through a different route, why two warehouses had a non-standard fallback, why one table was cached more aggressively than the others, why if you changed the order of checks in one module, you'd get cleaner code and a disaster 3 days later. There was documentation, but honestly it was incomplete. Not because I was hiding knowledge on purpose, the business just grew faster than we were given time for proper technical discipline. It was always feature first, documentation later, and in logistics, later is a mythical creature. My direct manager was Laura. In the office, people called her Karen behind her back, and not without reason. She was related to one of the co-owners, some kind of niece-in-law or something. I never cared enough to figure it out. They put her in charge of operations and the IT teams, even though her technical competence was about equal to my love for karaoke. What she did have was everything else: a loud voice, absolute self-confidence, corporate buzzwords for every situation, and a way of talking to people as if she were doing them a favor by allowing them to collect a paycheck. Her favorite phrases were, we're all one family here, we need engagement, no one is irreplaceable, and team spirit's also a KPI. She especially loved pressuring people who didn't like the spotlight. In other words, me. I worked around her for years. I attended important meetings when I absolutely had to. I tolerated her flip chart speeches. I politely declined fun activities. I worked, I delivered results. I even got bonuses sometimes, though always with a look on her face like she was paying them out of her own pocket. The problem started near the end of the year when they decided to throw a big appreciation corporate party for the team. It wasn't just an after-work get-together. It was a mandatory event in a banquet hall with a rented host, a photo booth, alcohol speeches from the owners, and some ridiculous award categories like Heart of the Company. I said from the beginning that I wasn't going. At the time, I was in the middle of stabilizing the reservation module ahead of peak sales season, and in general, I'm not someone who relaxes in a crowd under loud music. Laura called me into a conference room, closed the door, smiled that smile that always meant manipulation was coming. Marco, she said, glancing at something on her tablet, you need to be there. The team has to see that the technical department is engaged. I told her I had deadlines and I could stay online in case something went down. This is not a request, she said. It's a question of loyalty. And frankly, bonuses for this year haven't been finalized yet. I wouldn't want anyone to look not like a team player. She deliberately paused on the word bonuses. I remember that very clearly. So I went, in jeans and a button-up shirt, no enthusiasm, planning to sit through the minimum and go home. The hall was your typical banquet venue, shiny tile floors, decorative lighting, round tables, a stage, a cheap fog machine effect. At the entrance, someone had spilled something, water or a cocktail, I think, and I noticed the floor near the bar had a strange shine to it. There was no warning sign. I grabbed water because at corporate parties I only drink water, stepped aside so I wouldn't be in the crowd, and about 20 minutes later, Laura caught up with me and said, "See, nothing scary." A few minutes later, someone asked me to say a few words to one of the directors at the other end of the hall. I started walking over. Near the bar, my foot shot forward so suddenly I didn't even have time to react properly. I remember a blunt impact, the air getting knocked out of my lungs, and a sharp pain in my lower back that made my vision go dark. I didn't pass out, but for a few seconds I couldn't get up properly. What I remember most vividly isn't that I fell, it's the reaction. One of our people ran over, someone called the venue staff, Laura leaned down, and the first thing she said was, "Can you stand up? The owner's about to go on." Not, "Do you need a doctor?" Not, "Are you okay?" That. They did take me to urgent care, and then came the tests. MRI, doctors, nothing paralyzing, but the back injury turned out to be serious. Inflammation, severe pain, sitting and movement restrictions, a treatment course, physical therapy, painkillers. I couldn't sit at a computer for long without pain, and my job was, surprise, sitting at a computer. The next workday, I emailed HR and Laura with a description of the incident and a request to document everything officially. If a corporate event is mandatory and an injury happens there during a company event, that should be formally recorded. I wrote it dry, no emotion, like I always do. Laura replied an hour later, short, something like, "Let's not dramatize. It was a holiday event, not a production shift. Rest for a few days and come back." HR stayed silent. 2 days later, she called. I was still lying down with ice on my back. "We really need your engagement right now," she said. "Can you at least be online a few hours a day? You don't even have to sit. You can work from a laptop, from the couch, whatever." I told her I had doctor's recommendations and that I wanted the incident handled properly. That's when the tone changed. "Marco, if you go into formalities right now, this will drag on for months. We're right at the edge of peak season. I don't think this is a good time for escalation." That was the first time I felt not just irritation, but cold anger. They forced me to come. I slipped on a wet floor with no warning sign, and now they were trying to convince me not to escalate. I filed a workers' compensation claim, no threats, no scene. I just collected the paperwork, medical findings, the email trail, and filed. I wasn't even thinking about lawsuits yet. I just wanted everything handled correctly and not to be left alone with the medical bills and treatment. After that came the usual pressure in the style of, "We're not doing anything, but you can feel that we are." Suddenly, I was removed from several important technical calls. Access to some internal chats was restricted for communication optimization. One of the junior devs messaged me privately that Laura was asking how much time Marco's work actually takes and whether my task could be distributed across the team. A few more weeks passed. I was still treating my back and going to physical therapy when they scheduled a call with HR and Laura. I knew almost immediately what it would be. Those quick sync calendar invites all sound the same. They told me the company was restructuring the technical direction and that my role no longer aligned with current operational needs and that I was being let go. No specific complaints about my work, no failures, just corporate script. Laura barely looked into the camera for most of the call. I asked only one question. "Is this related to the workers' comp claim I filed?" HR answered without blinking, "Absolutely not." Of course. I closed the laptop, lay back on the couch, and stared at the ceiling for a while. I wasn't even that scared. Mostly I felt disgusted. I'd spent years pulling their system through nights, weekends, and holidays whenever some synchronization node collapsed. And when I actually injured my back at their team celebration, they first tried to pressure me, then threw me out. The irony was that almost that same week, an old acquaintance messaged me, a guy I'd once worked with on a carrier API integration. He'd already been inviting me for 6 months to join a small startup. They were building software for B2B suppliers. No gloss, no corporate shows, but a real engineering culture. Remote first, asynchronous communication, no mandatory office attendance, no team building costume contests. I was honest and told him I was in the middle of back treatment, might not be able to start at full speed right away. He replied, "That's fine, we need a brain, not a body in a conference room." That was one of the best things I'd heard from management in years. I joined them about a month later, at first on a light schedule. I worked lying down or standing, depending on what my back allowed. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was being judged by results, not whether I clapped at a company party. Meanwhile, at my old company, a former coworker told me a slow, very expensive collapse began. Not in one day, not like in a movie where someone presses a button and the server room explodes. No, worse. Strange bugs started surfacing. The system would assign an order to a warehouse where the stock had already been reserved for a B2B client. Under heavy load, inventory updates would lag and customers got sold items that weren't actually there. During peak hours, routing started throwing orders too aggressively to farther warehouses because someone had optimized a cache threshold without understanding why it had been set that way. None of these were disasters on their own, but together they hammered SLA performance, returns, shipping costs, and the trust of major clients. Laura, just as I expected, first reacted with nothing critical, then with the team is just adapting, then with Marco left technical debt and bad documentation. Someone forwarded me a screenshot of that, and I didn't even feel offended. Classic move. When everything works, management gets the credit. When it starts falling apart, blame the introvert they themselves fired. Then the call started. First from my former team lead, who I had always been on decent terms. "Hey, can you take a look at one log, just as a favor?" I looked, told him what the issue was, told him where not to touch anything without tests. That was it. A week later, Laura herself called. That actually made me laugh. She started in a very soft, almost gentle tone, said emotions ran high on both sides, that the company values my contribution, that the team misses my expertise. I stayed silent. She offered a one-time call, then a contract for a few hours a week, then a return to a staff position. "We can discuss a promotion," she said, "and a significantly higher salary, and a new title if that matters to you." Titles never mattered to me. Behavior did. I told her I would not return as an employee at all, and that all requests had to go in writing through an official channel, not through her personal number. After that, according to people I knew inside the company, the situation escalated. One major client, a retail chain with strict delivery time windows, filed a formal complaint over a series of failed shipments. Not one incident, a series. That triggered contractual penalties, claims, and a demand for a corrective action plan. And instead of honestly reporting the scale of the problem to the co-owners, Laura allegedly started smoothing the reporting. Some incidents were reclassified as isolated cases, some dates were shifted, and some losses weren't included in the summary for the board at all. This wasn't a movie-style forged signature on a check. It was ordinary corporate small lies, the kind that become huge when multiplied across millions in revenue. The turning point came when one of the co-owners, not the one whose relative Laura was, got a direct phone call from the client. Not through sales, not through operations, directly. In business, those calls sound like a siren. After that, they launched an external audit of operations and IT reporting. External audit, exactly the thing Laura had been trying to avoid. I found out afterward when their CFO messaged me, short, no theatrics, "We'd like to discuss short-term consulting," not through Laura. At that point, I knew they had real problems. We got on a call. On it were the CFO, one of the co-owners, and their lawyer. And for the first time in this whole story, I heard someone at the top say a simple sentence: "We made a mistake." They didn't ask me to be understanding. They didn't talk about family. They said the audit was underway, the system was unstable, they needed someone who understood the architecture, and they wanted to sign me as an independent consultant, fully remote, on my terms, with a specific hourly rate. Separate pay for documentation and training the new team. I named a number high enough that I wouldn't resent the time or stress. Honestly, I even padded it a little, expecting negotiation. They agreed almost immediately. That told me a lot about the scale of their losses. Under that contract, I wasn't coming back. I had no manager in the form of Laura. I worked directly with the technical director they had temporarily assigned as supervisor and with the development team. My task was very clear: stabilize the critical components, explain the logic of the key modules, build proper documentation, and train 2 new back-end developers and 1 SRE not to break things that looked ugly but existed for a reason. By the first week, it was obvious how bad things had gotten. The guys they hired after I was fired weren't stupid, they just had no context and were working under pressure from someone demanding quick wins in a system where quick fixes without understanding consequences are the fastest road to expensive mistakes. We pulled logs, walked through incidents, rolled back a few optimizations, and laid out why the routing behavior had gone weird. Within 2 weeks, the situation was already under control. By then, Laura had effectively been removed from technical decision-making. Formerly, she remained in the company a little longer, but after the audit was completed, she was fired. I don't know every detail of their internal mess, but from what the CFO told me, the external review found concealed operational losses, manipulation of management reporting, and issues with how decisions had been documented when key roles were cut at the height of system risk. Plus, obviously, they really didn't want the story of my termination during an active workers' comp claim to become part of an even bigger legal conflict. As for relatives and money, that wasn't some Hollywood punishment either, but a very ordinary corporate mechanism. The company lost a significant amount on SLA penalties, emergency fixes, the external audit, legal support, and client compensation. Part of it came out of reserves, and part of it came through redistributing owner payouts. The co-owner, whose relative had pushed Laura into the role and protected her for so long, according to people inside, lost a very noticeable amount of money and influence. Officially, no one would ever say he paid for Karen's damages, but in practice, that's exactly what happened. Business likes to name things more softly than they really are. I worked that consulting contract for 4 months. In that time, we got the documentation to a level I wouldn't be embarrassed to show in an interview. We set up proper runbooks, split module ownership, added monitoring in places that had been postponed for years. I ran several technical sessions for the team, recorded explanations for the riskiest components, and most importantly, passed on the context, that invisible layer of knowledge without which the system looks like just a pile of services. I didn't leave the startup either. They let me temporarily reduce my workload while I wrapped that contract. If your company has that one person because of whom somehow everything just works, maybe it's not magic. Maybe it's a person you shouldn't force into a corporate party by threatening their bonus. Laura kept repeating, "No one is irreplaceable." And formally, yes, she was right. They replaced Marco. It's just that first the company lost a ton of money, then got hit with an audit, penalties, and client problems. And our next story. How I closed a neighbor's path to the lake they'd used for years. Earlier this year, I purchased what had been an estate property. By the time the original owners passed, they hadn't lived there for close to a decade. The place sits on a large wooded lot with lake access at the back, and when I first saw it, overgrown, didn't even begin to cover it. Brush everywhere, vines swallowing fences, and paths that clearly hadn't been maintained in years. It was quiet, secluded, and exactly what I wanted. I worked from home, keep to myself, and figured I'd barely notice the neighbors thanks to the trees and spacing between properties. At first, things were pleasant. While I was clearing brush and starting renovations, neighbors occasionally wandered over to introduce themselves. Most of them were friendly, telling me how nice it was to see someone finally taking care of the place again. I didn't mind the conversations, it felt neighborly, and I figured that was that. The problems didn't start until I got to the final phase of the work. I had a concrete pad poured for my van and finished installing fencing around the property. I hadn't officially moved in yet, but once the pad and driveway extension were done, I parked my van there to keep it off the street. A few days later, when I came back to finish moving, I noticed a massive gouge running the length of the van. It wasn't a scratch, it looked like something large had been dragged or squeezed past it. I was furious, but with no cameras up yet and no witnesses, there was nothing I could do but file it away as a very expensive lesson. Once I officially moved in with my dog, I started closing the gates. Between the damage to the van and the fact that I now had an energetic dog on the property, it felt like common sense. That's when I learned I'd apparently committed a crime against the neighborhood. Within days, people started knocking. At first, it was polite enough. "Hey, just wanted to let you know you blocked the path to the lake." I explained that I owned the property, that I had a dog, and that I wasn't comfortable with people walking through my driveway. That explanation did not go over well. I was told repeatedly that the previous owners always allowed it and that everyone had been using that route for years. The knocks turned into interruptions, 3 or 4 groups a day, sometimes entire families, sometimes people with boats. More than one person asked me to move my van so they could back a trailer down my driveway to the water. At that point, it clicked how my van probably got damaged in the first place. When I said no, I was met with sighs, eye rolls, and lectures about how I was changing things and not being neighborly. The breaking point came when people stopped knocking entirely and just started opening the gate themselves. I'd hear it creak open while I was working, look outside, and see strangers standing on my driveway. One man had the nerve to complain that my dog was loose after he'd opened a clearly marked gate. I told him flat out, "You opened the gate onto my property. That's on you." He didn't appreciate that answer. That's when I hardened my stance. I installed no trespassing signs, a sign warning about the dog, proper locks on the gates, cameras covering the driveway, and an intercom by the front door. Now when someone rings the bell, I can tell them I'm working without having to walk halfway down the property to explain myself yet again. Summer ended, but the entitlement didn't. I started finding notes taped to the gate, then voicemails. The messages all said the same thing in different tones. According to them, access to the lake was grandfathered in. Apparently, because the previous owners didn't care or weren't around to care, this gave the neighborhood permanent rights to my land. 2 houses in particular took it upon themselves to act as spokespeople, a woman in her 50s and a couple around the same age. They claimed to represent the homeowners association, which was news to me since there was no HOA mentioned anywhere during the purchase and no covenants attached to the deed. Some messages were written like legal notices, full of bold claims and fake authority. Others were downright nasty, telling me I'd ruined the neighborhood and that I should be ashamed. One voicemail ended with, "People like you don't last long around here." That one went straight to my attorney. Their grandfathered claim is the heart of their anger. They took a decade of neglect and lack of enforcement and convinced themselves it created a permanent right. They rewrote history to turn permissiveness into permission, and then into ownership. Their legal-sounding notes were an attempt to make their fantasy sound official because they knew it couldn't stand on actual law. Speaking of which, my lawyer has been very clear there is no easement, no implied access, no grandfathered anything. He's pulled records, surveyed boundaries, and confirmed that the lake access is entirely within my property lines. Legally, I'm on solid ground. Emotionally, though, it's exhausting. These are people I'm going to live near for years, and I never intended to start some kind of territorial Cold War. The irony is that if someone had approached me once politely to ask about occasional access, I might have been open to a conversation. Instead, they treated my land like public infrastructure and acted offended when I stopped them. What really sealed it for me was the assumption that their convenience mattered more than my property, my dog, or the damage already done. At this point, I'm done justifying myself. The gates stay closed, the cameras stay on, the intercom exists for a reason. If they want lake access, they can find it the same way everyone else does, without trespassing. I didn't buy an estate property just to inherit a neighborhood's unspoken rules and sense of entitlement. I wanted a quiet place to live. What I got instead was a crash course in how quickly friendly neighbors turn hostile when free access gets taken away. The lake is still there. The trees are still standing. The only thing that changed is my property is finally being treated like what it is, mine. Each of these stories is about power dynamics, a boss who ruled by fear, a supervisor who valued policy over people, and neighbors who confused access with ownership. In every case, the person pushed back not with a louder argument, but with a smarter one, leaving evidence that kept speaking, finding logic within absurd rules, and invoking the actual law. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.